Hi guys. Well, it's that magical time of year again. Awdry Diorama Challenge time. This time the admins have changed it a bit. No digital models, which I'm kind of happy about, and it needs to fit within a 30 by 30 centimetre square. That's not bad for me, as it's actually quite large for a 009 diorama. So, which illustration to choose? Well, I used one with Skarloey last year, and this time I wanted to make Rheneas. So I went to gallant old engine, and in all honesty, I really wanted to do one with Sir Handel. But let's not talk about Bachmann's lack of Sir Handel at the moment. Then I thought, why not use Skarloey as well as Rheneas? So I will. Enter this bad boy. Onto the models. And as a recap, I built this Skarloey last year. I was pretty happy with the grubby finish on it. So when I went to make Rheneas last week, I went for the same look. After all, the railway's on its last leg, so the model should reflect that. The engines are ready, sure, but what about the scene? Well, let's talk about MS Models. You remember I've used their products on my builds before, such as the Nanguernal station or, well, any other buildings or bridge on the Christmas shelf layout. Well, they happen to produce the water tower. And when you size it up against the illustration, you'll see not only how close it mirrors the inspiration for the drawings, but also how lucky I am that MS Models are as skilled as they are. And, to continue my winning streak, Model U produce figures that basically look exactly like these two fellas. Onto the board itself. So, the criteria states 30 by 30, but for some reason, I went with 30 by 30 by 30. So I'll make a start by gutting the frame. I don't need the glass, the foam fillers, the white insert, or the retaining metal clips on the frame itself. The latter just pull out with pliers. I wasn't going to use the wooden back piece either, but then I decided to use it as the base of the diorama. So I'll quickly rip off the hanging brackets. As these are just glued on, brute force wins the day. The backboard, now base, needs to now get trimmed down to less than 30 centimeters. So a strip is marked and cut off on two sides. I used a hobby knife for this, and it took about 3 years to get through the board. Next time I'll use a jigsaw or some other unhealthily masculine machine. This board will sit flush in the frame when standing up. And because of the lip, the board needs to be lifted up on spacers. These black strips are actually the foam fillers that came in the frame, and worked well for this job. I just glue a couple back to back with a couple of drops of super glue. And with 3 sets around the outside and 1 in the middle to support, I can test fit it in the frame. Yep, it works. The next job is to build the box over the top of the baseboard. For this I wanted something light, and more importantly, something readily available for me in short notice. Enter foam board. I bought this in a local craft shop. It's also nice and easy to cut out with a knife. When the 3 sides have been glued together in a 3-sided box shape, I added a couple of spaces on the corners for strength. Because I wanted this to complement last year's Awdry Diorama Challenge build, I wanted to paint the 2 side pieces black. I've got here some random black spray paint, and went at it like a 90s graffiti artist. The spray booth in the background is actually on here, and eventually will suck about 60% of the fumes away, but the remaining 40% is all mine. As the black's drying, I went on to the water tower. The only actual building involved gluing the top cover on, and the tap. The parts didn't need any cleaning up, which was something I like. The model was attached to a cotton bud and coated with grey car primer. The main body colour was sprayed on with an airbrush. I went with this particular grey because it's a very nice warm grey, and I also have quite a lot of it. It's actually extremely close to the grey car primer that I use, but I guess enough of a change to bother showing you, so there we go. When that was dry about 30 seconds later, because the temperature outside is still about 52 degrees Celsius, I could commence with the individual slates. The first pass was done with a darker grey than the main colour. I try not to think about it too much at which stones I'm going to paint, I just go for it. I find that this lack of preparation or thought leads to more natural random patterns. And then the process is repeated with a lighter colour than the main. This one that I like to use actually has a blue tint to it, which works well for certain slates. The top of the slate block was picked out in light antique white. This colour stains really nicely with black washes, so will look like dirty cement or something similar. You'll see. With the tower dry, I can now go over it with a dry brush. This will tone down the colours a bit and also add some age into the model. I try and only actually make contact with the model on the downstroke, so it acts a bit like a highlight as well. The tank on top is going to be a simple black. I've gone over it in a couple of coats now because I wanted a nice solid finish. The hose is still separate, but it made sense to paint it before adding it to the tower. I would have gone with black for this as well, but it looks like it's brown in the picture, and as I'm a mere pawn in this game, I follow suit. The black tank is dry, and whilst I didn't want to make it look too rough, I did want to dry brush it a little to add something. The hose can now get glued on, so a drop of super glue on the tap will be more than enough. The end of the hose hooks over a little hanger on the corner of the tower, which I didn't realise at first and broke it off. So I made a new one out of brass. You wouldn't know, but I thought I'd mention it in case you do the same. It would be plain daft to finish this water tower without any rust on it, so I'll add a little bit around the joints of the tap section. You can get loads of rust type paints, but for some reason I've gone round making my own using rust weathering powders. I've also mixed rust with dark brown and brushed it down the side of the tower, where the water has been dripping for years, leaving a stain. The final job for this model was to make the stonework pop with an enamel black wash. The enamel washes are really good at settling between the joins between the stonework, creating a better illusion of depth and shadow. One detail that you may have noticed I haven't mentioned so far is the coal bunker. I haven't yet found a product to use for this, so I'll just make one myself, from scratch, from plasticard. I've engraved the plasticard with my pointy tool thing to separate the planks, and then I'll cut the sides out as a long strip. I need to add a bit of surface texture, so I'll just run the file down it a few times. This should also sort out the raised lips around where the pointy tool thing has been working. The sides are all cut out, not based on any particular dimensions, but more on what space I had available between the tracks on the diorama. It's an odd one, because the engines are drawn next to each other in one photo, the one I'm modelling, but in others of the same area there's a good 10 meters or so between the lines. Contradiction. The sides need corner battens added, and these, being plasticard as well, can just get glued together using liquid poly. When I glue parts like this together, I do tend to do it on a block of glass to keep it all as flat as possible. The sides can then get glued together. I decided that it would be better to build this one onto a plasticard base for support. The liquid poly takes some time to dry, so I've got some time to position everything correctly. After a couple of coats of car primer, I can now begin to paint it. I'm using the airbrush to apply earth brown, which is a great base for wooden surfaces. I'd have liked to have had more time on this model, but I've only got a couple of hours free, so really quick methods are being used instead. To age the wood a bit, I'll dry brush along the grain, which should help pick out the texture from the file. And then I'll add a black wash. This looks dark going on, but it'll dry lighter. But the reason I'm adding it is that it'll stain the surface of the bunker. It's still drying, and as I've got no time to waste, I'll crack on and add the coal now. You'll notice that the pieces of coal are much larger than the stuff I use in the engine's bunkers, because it is. But I'm going to go with the idea that it's being dropped off here in large chunks and the crew are breaking it down for the engines. In reality, I've had this stuff for years, and I can't find anywhere else to use it, so it seems a good excuse to get rid of it. The coal pile is adjusted a bit and then sprayed with isopropyl alcohol to break the surface tension. And then the scenic cement is then sprayed through the gaps. This will eventually dry and fuse it all together. Okay, so I've got the components ready so I can start to look at how to arrange the scene. I want to have it all on an angle, as not only will this make photographing the scene in the picture much easier, but also it should make the final scene feel much more natural than if it was parallel to the board sides. You can see what I mean about the track spacing. With the bunker between the two lines, it's impossible to have the engines up against each other. Happy with the look of that, I'll mark the boards where the pieces are sitting. This will help relocate them when I move things round later on. The terrain looks really flat behind the water tower, and it should technically be completely flat in front of the track towards the viewer, as there's more yard there. But for an individual scene like this, I felt that it was a tad boring, so decided to raise it up a bit. I'm using a couple of scrap pieces of polystyrene glued on for this. It should only be a subtle raise, but just enough to make it natural and uneven. And with the pieces of polystyrene in place, I can go at it with the hot wire foam cutter. Super easy and well worth having in your arsenal. The only problem is that you can't cut up flush against the wooden board, but if I'd planned it, I'd have cut the piece before gluing it on. The best bit is that it makes the polystyrene usable again, because as it melts its way through the material, it doesn't rip any of those stupid little balls off that get stuck to near everything. The track sections were rough size when I found them, so I just need to trim them down to fit the scene. And when I say trim to size, I mean shorter than the actual board, because the box that I made to sit around the scene actually sits on top of the board, not around it, so it's still within the 30cm limit. Nice and legal. The tracks now look about the correct length, so I'll start gluing everything down. I'm only using PVA for the details here because they shouldn't have any stress on them, so shouldn't move. Besides, when it's all ballasted, it should hold it all down. Ah yes, ballast. This is actually the remains of the mix that I used on Corris. I forgot I had it, so it was a nice surprise to open a drawer to see it. The dirt that's mixed into it will give some interest to the floor covering. Though as there wasn't quite enough to go around, I did have to mix in some more ballast, and some slate dust as well. And unlike the other layouts where the ballast is neat and sleeper height, this is going to be almost rail height. I'll brush it around to get it looking somewhere near. And then with the paintbrush lying down across the railheads, I'll scrape the top of the ballast off across the diorama. And like the coal bunker, I'll start the setting process by spraying the whole thing with IPA. This needs to be a really good covering, almost soaking, as any patches below the surface left dry will struggle to let the glue run in between the stones and remain loose. The glue itself is once again scenic cement. I would have used Baseboard here as it seems a much tougher finish, but alas I have none after finishing Nantgwernal's platform and ballast. After a day, the ballast layer is dry enough to let me proceed, which is good because now I have about 2 days until the challenge deadline. You understand the haste. I want to start applying the ground covering, and this doesn't want to look like a lovely lush field. It needs to look like the unkept yard of a middle-aged divorced man who works too much unpaid overtime. To achieve that look, I'm going to stipple PVA into the base, leaving clear gaps between the patches. And when the whole layout has been dosed, I'll set to work with my broken static grass applicator. Seriously, this is literally unpowered now. Like a sieve in the kitchen would do the same job as I'm getting here. Pathetic. I have a plan though. Okay, well whilst the static grass wasn't actually standing up on end while I applied it through the late applicator, I can just turn the base upside down and pat it. Not only will this release built up stress and resentment from a week of work, but it'll also drop off any unglued grass fibres to be used again. Due to this grass needing to be a bit more wild, I'll use hairspray to add more patches to build it up. My mum brought me this hairspray. I'm not sure if it was meant for my hair or not, so this is probably what she had it in mind for. On a serious note, this is the #1 tip you should take when using static grass. Build it up in layers. Places like Scenics will tell you the same thing. Have a base layer and then add more on top. One single pass in a uniform length just never looks right. And now comes the ultimate black wash. I've mentioned in the past how my favourite YouTuber is Nightshift, and he always paints his dioramas black before moving on to painting, so I'll do the same, because I want to be him. It would need another pass to get really dark, but it doesn't need to do that because it's basically uniform, so it'll be okay, I think. And now I can start building up the colours to what I would like. Starting with the ballast. In the picture it looks very yellow, which is a strange one to go for, but I'll give it a go. And when that's all been coated, I'll move on to the grass areas. Again, the picture looks like the grass is pale and almost dying. I've chosen greens to reflect this. Spraying the grass for this technique is slightly different to how Nightshift does it, because when he sprays out the grass to make it look fuller, I'm spraying it across the fibres to make the base darker, which I'm hoping will work better for the shadow effects. I'm really enjoying this technique because it's clean to do. The sprayed paints are super thin and dry really quickly, and using custom colours on the grass means that you have much more scope for models than with what just comes out the packet. To try and give variety to the grassy areas, I'm adding another coat of paint. This time it's a darker green, and I'm trying to paint the areas over where the grass looks like the fibres are bunched together. Because the sleepers have been painted to blend in with the ballast around them, all I need to do here is paint the rails. And to be fair, I really like these colours. I think if I was ever modelling a line such as the Fairbourne that goes through dunes, I'd use this colour palette to do it. The rails don't take too long to do, and it does help to keep it slightly thinned, which lets the paint travel much further down the rail. I can then begin to weather the track. This starts with a pass of rust along the rail sides. This fades across the ballast and does the job of weathering powders that I've used on Nantgwernal. Good to know that I can do it this way, because the powders take a while. And then the same process is repeated, but this time with the black acrylic. It looks like I'm adding too much here, but in reality, the engines are standing here for quite a while, either for coal, water, or just to sit outside the sheds, so it makes sense that the ground would be pretty grubby pretty quickly. I also try and get the black sprayed from the front and back, because the rails would get in the way, leaving the ballast behind them looking squeaky clean. And whilst that I said that I like the colour palette, I don't think it's right for this particular scene. It's a little bit too beachy, so I'm going to quickly turn up the saturation with another pass of a different green. This was the right thing to do, and you can see instantly the difference that it makes to the grass. That should be all the airbrushing done, so I can now run across the rails with a track rubber. Okay, these rails aren't actually going to be powered, but I guess I could shunt the locos up and down if I wanted to. I'm going to add some visual interest to the ground here by using a lighter shade of cream on top of the larger stones on the floor. This makes them both stand out and look heavier than without the step. Right, well I thought I'd finished the grass, but it still looks a bit too neat, so I'm going to apply more hairspray and add a third or fourth, I can't remember at this point, coat of a longer 6mm dead grass. This is just a very thin layer, but it should have enough to look interesting. And then we're back to the familiar territory. The last part to add to the scene will be the shrubbery. These use the same techniques and products as I used on Corris, which start with spraying patches on the grass with hairspray where the bushes are to be placed, and then the body of the bush can be planted, I guess. This is polyfibre, which is like a clump of hair pulled out of the Grinch's shower plug hole. You can tease it out super thin and use it for trees and bushes. And with another quick blast of hairspray I can apply the foliage. Leaf scatter is one product that I will use on all models. So in this example I'm using a fair bit of yellow on top of the green base, which actually looks a bit like gorse. Note to self. The last detail on the scene are the figures. There are only the two, and I'm looking at the crew in the picture, they're both wearing the similar overalls. This makes painting these figures nice and fast. The skin's painted up in a couple of tones, and then onto the blue for the clothes. I usually add highlights and things, but then again it's getting super close to the deadline now. So let's just go basic and paint the details in now. The black wash will hide most of the missing detail anyway, so it'll be fine. They've dried hanging upside down to get the black into the shadows, and they're ready to glue onto the scene. The sitting man needs to be sitting closer to the front track. And with a drop of glue on his bum and his feet, he's set in place. The standing man needs to be a bit more centre, as he appears to be talking to both engines. He looks a little unstable talking to engines without faces, so let's just assume he's talking to the crews on the footplate. Well, that's the scene done, and the brighter tones on the grass look like it's been a good move. It's just the back scene to sort now. I did plan to paint it up like the diorama last year, but I didn't have time. So instead, a trip to my local model shop in Shrewsbury last week left me with this back scene. It's a photo of the moors, which I chose because of the more yellow tones in it, so it should look okay. Because I'm all about the hairspray now, I'll attach it with that. Making sure that the backboard has a really good coating of the spray, I can position the back scene on, which has had the section cut to fit the board. It's then just a case of working around making sure the back scene is making nice contact with the hairspray. And with that, we're about done. It's time to take the photo for the entry for the challenge, and ironically, the first thing I've done is take the diorama back out of the surround, as I want to photograph it with the Welsh rolling hills as the backdrop instead. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. Comparing it with the illustration, apart from the glaringly obvious lack of faces on the engines, the scene looks about right. And after a bit of focus stacking, this is the final photo. Okay, it was meant to be the entry photo, but then it turns out that for the challenge you must have a photo with a ruler in the scene to prove its size. Which I think is a stupid rule. Because, as you'll see when they release the entry photos, it stops you actually taking the photo replicating the scene in the book, which is what I really wanted to do. Hopefully that'll be amended if they do the challenge next year. Guys, if you're listening. And I really hope they do, because I love doing these scenes and there's loads more I'd like to have a go at. It's a welcome break from the longer projects such as Nantgwernal at the moment, and it lets you try out different techniques or methods. And whilst we're talking about the faces, I just want to mention them because I've had loads of comments on the Rheneas build video asking about it last week. I tried to get hold of some, but I couldn't get a reply from anyone who makes RWS versions like the ones in the book. Otherwise I would have added them on. Oh, and the other detail missing that people kept pointing out are the number plates, which were ordered about 2 or 3 months ago, and in classic light railway stores style, I'm still waiting for them to be delivered. They're on the way though. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. One diorama built in a single video. It's been a big one and I'm very tired now. In real life, this was actually built in a matter of 2 or 3 evenings. I cut corners and skipped steps to save time, but hopefully that doesn't hinder the final result. Okay, good. Well, I better get back onto Nantgwernal now. Cheers.